Esther the Queen by William M. Taylor. 2. A Great Feast and What Came of It. Esther chapter 1, verses 1 to 22. After the full description of Shushan the palace, given in the last lecture, there is no need now to say more concerning the place at which the feast described in this opening chapter was held. The festivities lasted, as we are told, for 180 days, and the long continuance of such occasions among the Persians has been particularly remarked upon by ancient writers. But probably the statement in the narrative before us does not imply that precisely the same persons sat down in the same gorgeously pillared banquet hall day after day for half a year. For the guests were, quote, all the princes and servants, the power of Persia and Media, the nobles and princes of the provinces, end quote. And it is hardly likely that all the chief representatives of the emperor, from India to Ethiopia, were simultaneously absent for so long a time from their seats of government. It may be that they came in relays, and that as the first comers went, others took their places, while as these departed, they were replaced by others, until all of them had been received and entertained. Perhaps, therefore, the writer simply means to say that the festive time lasted for half a year, that during all these 6 months state banquets were frequent, that at their close, the object contemplated by the emperor having been attained, a fete of 7 days was given to the inhabitants of Shushan itself, and that in the gardens surrounding the palace they were regaled with the choicest meats and the richest wines, while all around them were the most gorgeous fabrics which skill could make or wealth could purchase. Now, concerning this great festival, some particulars are noteworthy. The occasion on which it was held must not be lost sight of, though the author of this book passes it over in silence. It was the 3rd year of the reign of Xerxes. Now, we know from the Greek historian Herodotus that in that very year Xerxes, quote, summoned a council of the principal Persians, as well to hear their opinions as to declare his own, end quote, on the matter of the invasion of Greece. At first, on his accession to the throne, we are told that, quote, he showed little disposition to make war against Greece, and turned his thoughts to the reduction of Egypt, end quote. But after he had succeeded in Egypt, he was all the more inclined to listen to the advice of his cousin Mardonius, and seek to punish the Athenians for the defeat of his father at Marathon. Accordingly, at the council assembled in Shushan, he declared his purpose, quote, to lay a bridge over the Hellespont, and to transport an army into Greece, that he might punish the Athenians for the injuries they had done to the Persians and to his father, end quote. Nay, not content with that, he added, quote, I intend, with your concurrence, to march through all the parts of Europe, and to reduce the whole earth into one empire, being well assured that no city or nation of the world will dare to resist my arms, after the reduction of those I have mentioned, end quote. He was opposed by his uncle, Artabanus, but ultimately, under the influence of Mardonius and some illusory oracles which fell in with his own ambition, the die was cast, and the decision was made to prepare for and carry out the invasion of Greece with such an army as the world had never before seen. Now, it was in connection with this determination, and in order, as I believe, to give the greatest possible impulse to the carrying out of the enterprise so resolved on, that this long-continued fete was held. The author of the book of Esther, indeed, merely says that his desire was, quote, to show the riches of his glorious kingdom and the honor of his excellent majesty, end quote. But that is in no wise inconsistent with the supposition that his purpose in showing these things was to give éclat to the undertaking on which he was entering, and to remove from the minds of his satraps all misgivings concerning its success. He wanted to produce in them the conviction that with such resources as he had at his command, it was impossible that he should fail. This accounts for the magnificent scale on which everything was done. The pillars were of marble, the couches were of gold, the pavement was of tessellated marble. There was royal wine without stint, and each one drank out of a vessel of gold, which was of a different design from all the rest. Everything was luxuriant and expensive. Ostentation was the order of the day. The great end which the monarch had in view was to make a display, and he made it with more than the usual oriental regardlessness of cost, so that there might not be left in any mind a single lingering suspicion of the sufficiency of his resources for the great expedition to which he was summoning his subjects. It looks supremely foolish, but it is a folly that keeps its ground to this day even in Western lands, where it is still the fashion for men to banquet themselves into enthusiasm for some great railway enterprise or some party campaign. Truly, we have not learned so much in these modern days as we think we have, and it might be wisdom in us to unlearn a few of the extravagances in which we are so prone to indulge. But one feature of this feast given by Xerxes strikes us as praiseworthy. It is said that, quote, "the drinking was according to the law, none did compel," end quote. All were left to do according to their pleasure. He that partook did not despise him who abstained, and he that abstained did not endeavour to force his practice on him who partook. Each was at perfect liberty to do as his own judgment dictated. Now, when we contrast that with the custom which used to be maintained by our fathers of pressing guests to drink whether they would or not, until it became difficult, almost impossible for them, indeed decently to refuse, we must confess that the difference is all in favour of the ancient Persians. And the statement here made reminds us of an incident which is said to have occurred at the table of Queen Victoria in one of the early days of her reign. The temperance movement was then just beginning to make its way into the upper classes of English society. And on the occasion to which I refer, a British nobleman, well known for his activity in all good causes, declined to comply with the request of one of his fellow guests that he should drink wine with him, whereupon the appeal was made to Her Majesty that she should assert her authority in the case. But she nobly replied, in the spirit of this Persian law, quote, "There shall be no compulsion at my table," end quote. And that reply did much to discountenance the old custom of badgering and browbeating and insisting upon guests to drink out of regard for their hosts until they felt themselves in a position where it was difficult to refuse, and were virtually compelled either to act against their better judgment or to do that which was considered rude and unmannerly. We have reason to be thankful that, alike in Great Britain and in this land, the temperance reformation has gained such a footing that now, as Dr. Rayleigh says, quote, "within the whole sphere of what is called society, anything approaching compulsion would not be tolerated, and, in fact, is never attempted," end quote. Much more is needed, as we shall presently see, before we shall have succeeded in purging ourselves from the plague of intemperance. But that is at least one point gained, and the gaining of that is due, more than to any other influence among us, to the efforts of our temperance societies. Another feature of this feast was the absence of the ladies from the board. They had their own festival, indeed, but they held it by themselves, because then, as indeed they are throughout the East until this day, the women were kept in uttermost seclusion, and, according to the public opinion of the time, it would have been in the highest degree immodest for any of them to be present on such an occasion as the banquet given by the emperor to the inhabitants of Shushan. It was no great privation to the ladies, but their absence was fraught with danger to the men, for it left them without any check to indulge to the full in the revelries of the hour. And in bygone times among ourselves, it was only after the ladies had left the table that the men permitted themselves to drink to excess, and to retail stories that were utterly unfit for modest women to hear, or a modest man to tell. It is to be feared that this is the case still in some circles that call themselves polite, but it ought everywhere to be frowned upon and put down. In the case before us, the law that none should be compelled to drink was largely neutralized by the example of Xerxes himself, for towards the end of the feast he became heated with wine, and then was guilty of an act which stamps him as essentially a low, sensual, and unfeeling tyrant. For he gave orders that Vashti, his queen, his favourite wife and the chief inmate of his harem, should appear among the revellers, quote, "with the crown royal, to show the people and the princes her beauty," end quote. His design apparently was that she should come unveiled, in order that all should envy him the possession of such a lovely wife. If Ahasuerus is to be identified with Xerxes, it is probable that Vashti is the same as the Amestris, who is spoken of by the Greeks as the wife of Xerxes, and whom he must have wedded before his accession to the throne. But however that may have been, the command of the king required her to do what was inconsistent with national usage, and as such would have been regarded as a violation of her modesty. Her obedience to it would have degraded her not only in her own estimation, but also in that of the whole community. According to the public sentiment of the time, she could not view the order otherwise than as an insult to her womanhood and a slur upon her honour. Therefore she set it at defiance and refused, quote, to come at the king's commandment, end quote. Opinions have differed concerning the wisdom of her conduct, and some, who apparently think it needful to degrade Vashti in order to exalt Esther, have condemned her for her disobedience. But for my part, I consider it worthy of all praise, and hold that she was entirely right in what she did. It is true that by the appointment of God the husband is the head of the wife, but the headship is not absolute and autocratic. Here, too, the government must be constitutional and within limits which have been fixed by the Lord himself. No husband has a right to command a wife to do that which is wrong, and liberty of conscience ought to be as sacred in the home as in the state. In all matters of indifference morally, in all questions of mere prudence, in all affairs of management and detail where no principle is involved, if there should be an honest difference of opinion between the two, the will of the husband should be carried out, and no true wife will ever think of doing otherwise. But where conscience is concerned, where principle is at stake, where character is affected, the wife should be left to act upon her own convictions, and no right-thinking husband would ask her to do otherwise. This, as it seems to me, is the constitution on which household government rests, and though it is always an evidence that there is something radically wrong when the matter comes to be disputed, yet the knowledge of these limits may keep things from coming to such a pass, and may lead to that mutual respect for each other's convictions as to duty which is essential alike to domestic peace and to loyalty to God on the part both of husband and wife. The reply of Vashti set Xerxes on fire with rage, and his counselors being, like himself, heated with wine, and so all the more likely to be the mere, quote, dittos, end quote, of their master, did not mend matters by their advice. To think of conquering Greece while he allowed a woman to set him at defiance was in their view absolutely absurd. They feared, withal, that the spirit of Vashti might become infectious and spread throughout their own harems, and so they insisted that Xerxes should put Vashti away, and gave also a recommendation, the result of which is thus recorded, end quote. The saying pleased the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of Memucan. For he sent letters into all of the king's provinces, into every province according to the writing thereof, and to every people after their language, that every man should bear rule in his own house, and that it should be published according to the language of every people, end quote. What a, quote, ridiculous mouse, end quote, is this, as the fruit of such, quote, labour, end quote, in the, quote, mountains, end quote. One can hardly keep from laughing outright as he reads the words. Truly, family government is near an end when it needs to be bolstered up by an imperial decree. And what mere edict can make a man worthy to bear rule in his own house? For, after all, the gist of the matter lies there. A man must rule himself first, if he would regulate well the affairs of his own household, and for self-rule something else is needed than an imperial decree. Quote, truly, end quote, as Dr. Kitto says, quote, one is amazed at the infantine simplicity of these famous sages in recommending the issue of a royal decree in all the languages of this great empire, that every man should bear rule in his own house. This is undoubtedly one of the most amusing things in all history. One cannot but imagine the inextinguishable burst of shrill merriment which rang through every one of the 127 provinces of the Persian Empire when this sage decree was promulgated, end quote. It must be that Ahasuerus and Xerxes are identical, for only one who could imagine that he could bind the Hellespont with a few iron fetters could have supposed that he could reduce women into absolutely passive submission to the autocracy of their husbands by the publication of an edict. Not thus is domestic peace or household happiness to be attained. When the law comes into that relationship, alas, it is to divide and not to unite. And when the apostles command, quote, "Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it," end quote, is faithfully obeyed by those to whom it is addressed, there will be no need of a civil enactment to enforce this other. Quote, "Therefore, as the church is subject unto Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything." End quote. But if a man makes himself heated with wine and issues orders that are abominable, he only makes himself ridiculous when he talks of his determination, quote, "to rule his own house," end quote. He has ceased to be the ruler of himself, and if a man know not how to be that, he is incapable of ruling his house. But now let us pick up a few lessons from this old history that may be useful to us in our daily lives. And, first of all, we are reminded by the incidents which have passed under our review that overconfidence is the forerunner of failure. The proverb says that, quote, "Pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall," end quote. And Ahab showed more wisdom than was common with him when he sent to Ben-Hadad this message, quote, "Tell him, let not him that girdeth on his harness boast himself as he that putteth it off," end quote. With an empire so large as to be already unwieldy, Xerxes might well have been content with what he had. Yet he must needs seek to wipe out the disgrace of his father's defeat at Marathon by the Greeks, and try for universal empire for himself. But as the unsuccessful gambler stakes more heavily than before, thinking to recover thereby all that he has lost, and ends by losing more heavily than ever, so Xerxes suffered a more disgraceful defeat than his father. The little country of Greece hurled back his legions in dismay, and wrought prodigies of valour, which have been for an inspiration to all who have battled for freedom in the world ever since, and which have made the name of Thermopylae everlastingly renowned, while the defeat of his fleet at Salamis, even though he sat himself upon a lofty throne in sight of all his ships to stir his sailors to enthusiasm by his presence, was so speedy and so complete as to give point to Byron's lines, quote, "A king sat on the rocky brow that looks o'er sea-born Salamis, and ships in thousands lay below, and men in nations, all were his. He counted them at break of day, but when the sun set, where were they?" End quote. Nor are we without an interest in the victory they won, for it was one of the decisive days of the world, and but for it, Oriental despotism might still have brooded over the fairest countries of Europe, and the whole history of the world been changed. Now, I do not say that Xerxes failed simply because he was so confident that he would succeed, or that if he had begun his campaign of invasion with less of ostentation and bravado, he would have conquered. But the issue of his expedition contrasts very suggestively with the braggadocio of its beginning, and is a warning to all not to rejoice over a victory until it has been won. There have been many similar cases in history. As we read the account of this banquet, we cannot help thinking of the spirit in which the first Napoleon began his march to Russia, and the terrible result of his obstinate rashness on that occasion. Nor can we forget how, within these last few weeks, the King Milan of Servia has been reproved for his Thrasonic declaration that he would keep his birthday in Sofia, the capital of Bulgaria. But the lesson is good for other departments than that of war, and it reads thus, "Young man, don't say with conceited boasting what you will do, but do it, and let the deed speak both for itself and you. See first, however, that it be a deed worth doing, and not merely the gratification of a selfish and unscrupulous ambition." But, in the second place, let us note here the evils of intemperance. If Xerxes had not been, quote, "heated with wine," end quote, he never would have given such an order to Vashti. Mark the phrase, quote, "heated with wine," end quote. It does not say that he was actually drunk. I call your attention to that because I believe that a vast deal of evil is wrought in the world by drinking that is short of intoxication. As Macri has admirably put it, quote, "There is a difference between not being intoxicated and being sober. A person may be able to speak and to walk, and yet may be guilty of excess in the use of strong drink. He may not have lost the use of his senses, and yet have lost the sound use of his senses." End quote. It is my firm belief that the great majority of accidents in the use of machinery or of dangerous agencies, such as steam, electricity, and the like, is due to this kind of drinking. The man has taken enough to disturb the balance of his nature. His conceit and confidence are stimulated. His judgment is weakened. His will is stiffened. And he is made reckless when otherwise he would have been cautious. If an inquiry were to be held, it could not be affirmed by anyone that he was drunk. But, for all that, he had been guilty of what for him was excess. Now, in these circumstances, does not prudence dictate that the man should let it alone altogether? His own safety and the safety of others are imperilled by his partaking of it, even in what others would call moderation, and therefore he ought always to be on his guard, and as the surest means of keeping right, he had better abstain entirely. But if that be so with drinking that is short of intoxication, what must be said of the actual drunkenness which is so rampant in the midst of us? It is a large question, and I cannot discuss it fully here. Let me only remark that the question has three departments, according as we look at the drunkard's appetite, the drinking customs, and the liquor trade. Now, as to the first of these, when a man is held in the grasp of the drunkard's appetite, there is no cure for him save in absolute and entire abstinence. His indulgence has so diseased his body that he cannot taste it without having created in him an irresistible craving for more. Clearly, therefore, he should never touch it again. And to encourage him in taking that course, Christian love should prompt others to take it with him, and to say, quote, "If drink make my brother to offend, I will drink no wine while the world stands. It is good neither to drink wine nor to do anything whereby a brother stumbleth or is made weak." End quote. That is the true scriptural ground on which the total abstinence movement rests, and to put it on any other basis is to weaken its appeal to Christian men. Looking now at the drinking customs, the cure is to abolish and discredit them. I think it is capable of proof that the existing customs in the matter of drink are very largely responsible for the manufacture of drunkards. So long as strong drink is the recognized medium of showing kindness or hospitality to a friend or companion, so long shall we have to deplore the fall of many young and noble men into intemperate habits. Therefore, smite these customs as with the hammer of Thor. Destroy them out of society and the land. Put away strong drink from the table as a beverage, and never conform to the custom of indulging in it as a mere libation to fashion. Why should a man to whom you have shown a kindness say to you, quote, "Come and have a drink," end quote, and you do not laugh at him as you would if he said, quote, "Here is a baker's shop, come and have a cake," end quote? Or why would everybody laugh at me at a banquet if I should say, quote, "Let us eat to the health of the president," end quote, and should hold up the wing of a chicken on the point of my fork for the purpose? While if I should say, quote, "Let us drink to the health of the president," end quote, everybody would cheer. Intrinsically, the one is as ridiculous as the other. Only the custom makes the difference, and that custom carries drunkenness with it as its lawful progeny. Dethrone the customs, therefore, and set something worthier in their room. Much has been done in this way already, but there is need for the doing of a greater deal more, and no patriot should be reluctant to put his hand to such a work. Then, last of all, there comes in the trade aspect of the case. The trade is licensed by the law. In one view, that may mean that it is encouraged by the law, and it does seem very inconsistent to license people to sell strong drink and then to keep a staff of policemen and judges and a whole assortment of prisons for dealing with those who are demoralized by their wares. But, on the other side of it, a licensed trade is a trade already restricted. It is a trade prohibited to all who are not licensed. It is, therefore, prohibition so far forth. And so, in every license law, the principle is involved that the state has the right to prohibit that which it licenses, only a certain number to do. Thus, the principle of prohibition is already recognized. Ought we, therefore, to have total prohibition immediately? To that I answer, let us have it just so far and so soon as the public sentiment will sustain its enforcement. We must not forget that a state enactment, in and of itself, will not secure obedience in this case any more than it could secure in the case of Xerxes that every man should bear rule in his own house. Any law is dead until the breath of public opinion is breathed into it, and then it lives. And if with your law you go far ahead of public opinion, you thereby provoke a reaction, and therefore injure rather than advance your cause. What we have to do, therefore, in the matter of legislation of a prohibitory character is, when public opinion has forced that wheel round to a certain point, to put on the ratchet of a law and hold it there, with no backward movement possible, until we are ready for another advance, and thus, step by step, we shall get on towards the goal that so many desire to reach. Meanwhile, every man can pass a prohibitory law on himself, and enforce that if he will, and that will prove his own sincerity in the matter. Finally, we are reminded here of the great change which the gospel has wrought on the position of woman. The separation of the sexes in this feast, and the insult shown to Vashti, are only typical of the treatment to which woman has been subjected in all heathen lands. Wherever the gospel has not gone, woman has been degraded into a slave and ground down beneath the galling tyranny of her husband. The barbarian of the East and the savage of the West have been alike in this, that they have driven the weakest to the wall, and she who was designed to be a helpmeet and companion to her husband, doubling his joys, dividing his sorrows, and throwing a halo for him round his home, has been trampled under the hoof of cruelty and branded with the scars of violence. We are far enough yet from what we ought to be in this respect, even in our own Christian land. But there is even among us an immense improvement over the state of things in ancient Greece and Rome, as well as over the condition of matters at this day in Turkey and Hindustan. And the change has been entirely due to the gospel of Christ. Not by any sudden and violent upheaval, indeed, was it effected. Had it been so, the civilized world would have been more conscious of its obligation to the Lord Jesus for it. But silently, gently, almost imperceptibly, the influence of Christianity filtered into the family, and there, touching the mainspring of our human life, it has purified and ennobled society at large. Quote, "What women these Christians have," end quote, said a pagan orator, who had been a teacher of Chrysostom, with a true perception of the influence of the gospel on them. For the religion of Jesus gave dignity to womanhood, holiness to motherhood, and happiness to the home. And, as an eloquent friend has said, quote, "It is a fact significant for the past, prophetic for the future, that even as Dante measured his successive ascents in paradise, not by immediate consciousness of movement, but by seeing an ever lovelier beauty in the face of Beatrice, so the race now counts the gradual steps of its spiritual progress out of the ancient heavy gloom towards the glory of the Christian millennium, not by mechanisms nor cities, but by the ever-new grace and force exhibited by the woman, who was for ages either the decorated toy of man or his despised and abject drudge." End quote. My sisters, have you not in this a new reason why you should value the gospel and be loyal to its Lord? And you, my brothers, who have so largely profited by this social regeneration, will you not hold with a firmer hand, because of all this, the truth which the anarchists of these days are seeking to wrench out of your grasp?